Welcome to the third webinar in the COVID-19 Ask the Experts webinar series. This webinar will address legal and ethical considerations for the remote delivery of school psych services. I am Stacy Kellemer-Skalski, and I am NASP's Director of Professional Policy and Practice, and I will be your moderator for this webinar. NASP has worked to develop a webinar to try and provide some support to school psychologists who are working remotely. We've put together a series of recorded webinars. They will be posted on the NASP website. These webinars are designed to support school psychologists and interns and practicum students as they navigate the delivery of these services during this pandemic. Each webinar will be followed by the opening of a discussion thread on the NASP member exchange community. The webinars are free and posted to the public, but to participate in that discussion thread, you will need to be a NASP member. Each webinar will address three things. They'll address critical questions emerging as a result of the need to provide visual or virtual telehealth school psych services. They'll provide some advice and guidance from our expert panelists, and they'll offer suggested strategies and resources for addressing professional practice issues. We hope that the webinars will be very helpful to you, and we direct you to the NASP website to review them. Our panelists for today are Dr. Dan Florell, who is an Associate Professor of Psychology at Eastern Kentucky University, and he runs a private practice. His research interests are in cyberbullying, telehealth, adolescence, and using technology to enhance school psychologist practice. He is NASP's online communication coordinator, historian, and he writes the Just a Click Away column for the Communique. Dr. John Garrido is a school psychologist in Central New York, president of the New York Association of School Psychologists, and currently serves as a Northeast representative for the NASP Ethics and Professional Practices Board. John also served on the 2020 NASP Standards revision writing team for NASP Professional Ethics, and his current interests are in neuropsychology, the assessment of the identification of learning disabilities, and the professional practice of school psychology. Melissa Perot is an associate professor in school psychology at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Dr. Perot serves on the Massachusetts Safe and Supportive Schools Commission and is the executive director of the Birch Project. She is also the co-chair of the NASP Ethics Committee. So welcome to all of our panelists. Before we hear from our panel of experts today, I do want to take a couple minutes just to provide a quick overview of some of the legal issues that are impacting school psychologists at this time. It's really important for people to keep in mind that public education is a state and local control issue for the most part. The federal role primarily extends to the protections of related civil rights and the administration of federally funded grant programs like Title I and Title IV and IDEA. And so in this situation, the U.S. Department of Education has released guidance for states on how to respond to COVID-19 in schools, but this guidance really only extends to a very narrow set of topics that may be impacting you from a legal or an ethical standpoint. There are lots of issues that will never be addressed by existing statutes or available technical assistance, and so it's super important that in this situation, you review what is being provided as guidance, but recognize that your knowledge, expertise, and ability to problem solve using ethical and legal problem solving models will probably be your most helpful to you. Remember, it's a pandemic, people, and everyone is blazing new trails here, and we all need to keep in mind that this is new territory as we wade through these issues. Again, make sure that you become familiar with the DOE guidance. We have posted it to our webpage, and it will be accessible at the end of this webinar through some of the electronic links. There was one thing I thought was really important for you to keep in mind, though, is that all of the U.S. Department of Ed federal guidance is really just guidance. It's not force of law. I thought there was a great article that Dr. Perry Zirkle from Lehigh University wrote recently where he commented on this. We did link that article to the end of this website I encourage all of you to read it. He helps us remember that in this situation, because of the nature of that local control, it's very important to see how guidance is interpreted by your states and by your locals, and to follow through with that by studying those things. Also, checking in with your school district's attorney can't hurt, and recognizing that for different states, the different statutes that they have, their state constitutions, all of these things will result in related, applications. And so you have to actually go to your own state for guidance. Now, I know that this is tricky. There are states right now that have issued guidance, and I've been watching on the NASP website where some people are, taking that guidance and just simply trying to adopt it for their own state. This is hard to do, you guys. It's hard because of the independence that each state has in the application of education policy and practices. It's really important to try and find ways to engage your administrators and engage your state leaders on these topics so that you make sure that what you are advising others peoples on are true. The federal guidance is really important. I don't want to minimize how important it is. I want you to recognize that all over the federal guidance, they've given flexibility to states, and your states could be using that very judiciously. That said, the primary focus of the federal guidance so far that's been issued to agencies begins with the importance of protecting the safety and welfare of all people as a top priority. They are really committed to that being your first line of action, protecting students, educators, and the community. Secondly, they are very interested and speak highly of the need to protect students with disabilities and those kids who could be perceived as being disabled under Section 504, like kids who actually have the virus, for example, to protect them from bullying and harassment, from the denial of access to FAPE, free appropriate public education, and also protecting them from inappropriate and inadequate delivery of special education-related services. Thirdly, the guidance clarifies compliance and some rules related to different issues. The guidance looks at issues related to timelines and conditions for the evaluation of students with disabilities, what you need to do right now, and what you can do right now. They do address conditions under which IEP teams may meet virtually. It talks about that, and it does not require IEP teams to meet face-to-face. There is information around the consideration of the delivery of virtual services that they've addressed, information around parental consent and the engagement of families, and also protecting the confidentiality of student records. There are three overriding themes that you will hear about. One is the theme for flexibility. They also are addressing people in state and local agencies and the importance of consulting them in the application of the guidance. And the third thing that the guidance really is talking about is the importance of remembering that our primary obligation is to provide FAPE under the Andrew versus Douglas County School District standard. Let's not forget what that guidance says. The Supreme Court ruled in Andrew versus Douglas County School District on March 22nd, 2017, that the obligation is to meet its substantive obligation under IDA. A school must offer an IEP reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. That phrase that I've highlighted, appropriate in light of the child's circumstances, has never been more important today. Today's circumstances are what are defining what we must do for the IEP to be reasonably calculated. What is needed by the child, what is feasible to do, what is appropriate to do given what we know as professionals, and what is safe for all involved are your most important considerations in the delivery of these services. In many cases, ethics are going to be your best guide when considering how to respond today. Let's keep in mind this as we now hear from our expert panel. Okay, for our first question, I'm wondering if Dan can address this. What are some of the general ethical issues involved with the remote delivery of school psychological services?
Well, thanks for having me on, Stacy. I think when you talk about ethics, a lot of ethical issues are going to fall into really four big buckets that the NASP ethical standards are organized around, as you're seeing on the slide. First is respect the dignity and rights of all persons. Your professional competence and responsibility. Of course, we're going to have a number of issues there in regards to telehealth and virtual services. Honesty and integrity in professional relationships, and responsibility to schools, families, communities, the profession, and society, which, of course, we've got a lot going on in all of those areas. I did want to point out also, beyond NASP, APA has probably the clearest guidelines for the practice of telepsychology and the standards that they set out in 2013, and I believe we have those on the website with some of these other webinars. But if people are looking for more specific guidance, it's really the major psychological guidance in the area of telehealth. So I wanted to just quickly highlight those, and along with the ethical issues in NASP. Primary areas to think about, and I know we have our other panelists and myself will elaborate on this a little bit later in the webinar, but the big things that we need to go ahead and discuss are issues related to confidentiality. In federal government, we have what we call HIPAA and FERPA. Both of those have been weakened or made more flexible, and during this time of crisis, we have the issue of informed consent, where we're all familiar with that, but it does look different in a telehealth service manner. The issue of beneficence and non-malfeasance, basically do no harm and try to do good. So this is working within your personal competence. Not to be said that you can't gain some competence with various trainings like some of these webinars and other things that are being offered online. So if you haven't had previous experience with telehealth, don't just rule it out as beyond your competence, because we are all very capable of learning new skills, as we're finding out quite quickly here. The issue of social justice, so the equity and access issue. We know a lot of our students don't have necessarily high-speed internet access, and so we need to look at what are those capabilities. The issue of fidelity, being faithful. We want to deliver services to the best of our ability given the situation, and we also want to try to protect test integrity by following standard protocols as closely as possible, or even maybe making the decision that remote assessment is not really a feasible activity, which is another thing that we all have to decide upon. Veracity, which is being truthful about competence, what you can and can't do. And of course, anything that's brand new to you, I would recommend always trying out on others before you try it out on students, kind of get through and ensure the quality of the service that you are able to provide. Now, as Stacy was talking about, this is uncharted territory for, I would say, the majority of us. And so when in doubt, we're going to apply the legal and ethical problem-solving models that we go back way back to grad school. And the good thing about ethics is they're frustratingly vague, and that the problem-solving model stays the same regardless of how many decades you've been in the field. So I'll turn it back to you, Stacy.
Great, thanks, Dan. Let's see, for question 2, we've really kind of got 2 parts to this. One, what do our NASP ethical standards say about the delivery of telehealth services? And then where the standards don't specifically address an issue, what is a good ethical and legal problem-solving model that can be used for making ethical decisions? And I'm going to ask Melissa and John to actually tackle this question.
Thank you, Stacy, for having us do this. I'm first going to talk about the standards that we have from our 2010, and that is what we have worked from and trained for the last decade. And we know that there is nothing specific about telehealth. That being said, the general principles of our ethical standards continue to apply. So for example, even though we have the do no harm and confidentiality, the expectation is that we do our best to maintain confidentiality within the context that we're now operating in, this uncharted territory, and continue to do the best service without harm that we can. But John, you were on the committee that helped revise the standards, and I know that the discussion of technology was really important. Can you say more about the new standards?
Right, and I think as has been identified already, we're in a different time, and one of the most important things that was in the old standards that we took a little bit of a close look at had to do with the area of competence, and there were a lot of school psychologists who are feeling that this is kind of new grounds. How do I deliver this in terms of remote service delivery? Do I have the skills to actually do this? And in our in some of our iterations, we actually took a page out of APA's book in terms of what to do when there aren't a lot of when there's not a lot of ability to provide needed services, in this case, face-to-face. One of the realities that even when we are delivering face-to-face that our rural school psychologists deal with is sometimes not a lot of school psychologists to actual students. So one actual major proposed revision that we were looking at actually loosens and relaxes the standard a bit about what do you do when you're the only person who can deliver something that may be outside your area of competence a little bit. And our proposed language that, again, we are waiting for adoption, so this isn't in stone right now, but it basically is about, again, that school psychologists do recognize the strengths and limitations of their training, and they still engage in practices only that they're qualified to, and engage the assistance of other specialists in supervisory, consultative, or referral roles as appropriate. But when there's no appropriate provider available, school psychologists explain the limitations of their experience to parents and seek consultation, training, and appropriate to make sure that students don't go without services. And that's a very key message in this current climate we're at. School psychologists may feel that they don't necessarily have had the very specific training in this kind of service delivery. But again, the important thing, as we all do for ethics, is we protect the most vulnerable, and we seek supervision and guidance from others. But we go ahead and we do the best that we can until we're able to kind of fill in that gap. And that's what we're doing right now. Most of us are used to working face-to-face, but right now, if we need to go out a little bit further outside our comfort zone to make sure that kids don't go without services, that's kind of a step that we take, if that makes any sense.
Yes. And Stacy, I think the next slide has some of the more specific information about problem solving. Thank you. Because this is the cornerstone that we go back to. We don't, as Dan said, ethics are vague, and sometimes there are not going to be clean answers, particularly in this time. And so having a process to go through as you're making decisions is really important. And I want to step us through each of these briefly. And the first is just really describing the problem situation and seeing, are there legal and ethical issues involved? Consult your ethical and legal guidelines. I hope most of you still have your textbook from that ethics and legal class that all of you are required to take in your graduate training. But if not, the ethics codes are available on the NASP website. So consult the ethical and legal guidelines, and then confer with your supervisors and colleagues. Consult other people that are also navigating this space and think through how to navigate these as you evaluate the rights, responsibilities, and welfare of all people that are impacted by this. You want to consider as many alternatives as possible. And from then, you select a course of action. You think about what you might see as the most reasonable course of action and then assume responsibility for it. If you're going through this process, my recommendation to you is that you also document your thinking and who you are working with as you're making decisions. as a way to help you go back as you're owning the decisions that you've made and finding a course of action that works in the best, again, with the beneficence and non-malfeasance goals, that you're working in a way of responsible caring to meet the kids' needs in these uncharted territory times.
Excellent. Thank you, Melissa, so much for guiding us through that. Our next question then is, how should school psychs prioritize the student needs and related services that they'll deliver? John, can you give us a little guidance around that?
Absolutely. Again, as Stacy nicely, as you said nicely toward the beginning, flexibility is really going to be the key during these times. And believe it or not, though, this is not too different from what we deal with every day. We have to consistently prioritize needs and consider what's going on with the student. As a school psychologist, there are times when I have to prioritize the needs of another child because what they're dealing with is more significant. So again, we all deal in a world where there's law, regulations, timelines, things like that. But right now, one of the most important things to think about is, what do we need to do to ensure that students are considering to continue to have their academic and social emotional needs met? And again, another key piece is that as we are prioritizing, we also have to think about what this new reality means. Let's think about school psychologists as related service providers. It's really important that school psychologists think about the implications of how they're going to provide related services. For example, how does individual and group counseling look different remotely as opposed to face-to-face? We need to ask ourselves, how closely can our services be delivered in this kind of service delivery versus face-to-face? For example, as Dan talked about a little bit earlier, if services are given remotely, confidentiality may look different. You may have parents or siblings nearby in a room who can hear some of the things that are being discussed. We also have to bear in mind that students may be a little bit more reserved to share different things as well. In a group counseling situation, there are other considerations. For example, they may be able to hear what's going on in other students' homes. So those kind of legal and ethical considerations must be kept in mind for the school psychologists as they're thinking about how to do service delivery. It's important for school psychologists to think about, what are the potential benefits? What do I want kids to get out of this time together? Okay, so again, let's think about a situation where I might prioritize. I might be working with two kids, one who has school phobia and the other who has anxiety about health problems in the world. Well, immediately, my student who has difficulty with some of those dangers of the world, their issues might be currently more pressing because that's something we're dealing with right now, and they may be having some more distress. But I don't want to downplay the need of the child with school phobia, because right now they may be away from their challenging area and they're going to start moving back toward something that's difficult. So we need to think about collaborating with the parent and child, thinking about a return to school. So again, just as in schools, we need to allocate more time to those needs that are most pressing. It's important for school psychologists to be mindful of what benefit they can confer. And again, as Melissa Pirro just talked about, using the problem-solving process when they're deciding those specific ethical dimensions. Also, as I'm going to talk about a little bit later, good progress monitoring is done. If a child has lost certain skills, we're going to want to make sure that we're identifying how those skills actually look. Again, when it comes to prioritizing, we want to think about and use our expertise as school psychologists to best understand what realities the child's currently dealing with and prioritize appropriately using our legal and ethical guidelines.
All right, so it sounds like really for when it looks at how we're doing, or what things we're doing, we consider our need, we consider the risks of delivering those services, and then the benefits that we hope to have conferred to the kids.
Right.
So, yeah, all of that sounds really great. Thanks, John, for sharing a little bit about that. Let's go on to the next question. So what are some of the confidentiality considerations that school psychs should be thinking about? Dan, could you take a stab at this?
Sure. And what I'd like to really focus on in this question are the two major federal laws regarding privacy and confidentiality of student/client information. And so just real quickly, most people are going to be familiar with FERPA. FERPA is the Rights and Privacy federal law that applies to all school settings. And then you have HIPAA, which is the law about the transference of electronic health records and in the health setting. Now, HIPAA does not explicitly apply to the schools, but I'm going to refer to it quite a bit here because I think it gives the best guidance on how in a telehealth virtual world that you would want to aspire to, even if FERPA is a little bit looser with the rules. And we have an interesting ethical issue or legal issue that's come up already in the fact that is the decision of when FERPA applies versus when HIPAA applies. Because typically if you were a school official and employed by a school, FERPA would apply, but you would be also working in the school. Now we have people who are spread out in their homes, and even though they represent the school, they are certainly not in the school. And so then does HIPAA apply? I think from what I've heard anecdotally, FERPA would still apply, but it is an interesting kind of issue that's come up. So let me get into the confidentiality considerations that we need to consider with these two sets of laws. With FERPA, what we really want to be concerned about is the way that we're storing information electronically and how we're protecting notes of services or the actual service itself. Now, most of us are going to be using cloud-based servers that encrypt storage and transmission of data, and we want to try to use those type of cloud-based services whenever possible. Many people are going to wonder about Google because there are so many school districts that are using Google. And I will tell you what I've told a lot of people, that Google is a HIPAA compliant software. So HIPAA compliance, when you hear that, it's a shorthand for saying that you have a level of security and encryption that would be acceptable for health records. Now, the problem is Google is only going to guarantee that if you keep everything within your school district. The moment that you share with an outside parent or an outside provider, the HIPAA guarantee kind of goes away because you're introducing more risk to the students' records. So if you really want to be secure, try not to share those records to any outside entity unless absolutely necessary. And if you do, I wouldn't just share the folder. I would download the document and I would encrypt that document and then send it in another way to protect that kind of bubble of confidentiality that would be established there. Of course, we're using these Google and cloud accounts. You want to use very strong passwords for these telehealth accounts because that's the surest way to violate confidentiality, is to have someone access your account. So you can look online on how to make the most secure passwords. We won't elaborate in this short kind of format. And then you also want to encrypt documents as much as possible. If you use Microsoft Word, it is very easy to encrypt documents. You just go into Save As, and you can see right there, it'll say Protect Document, and it's as easy as that. If you're using something like Google Docs, it is not that easy because Google doesn't allow you to encrypt the Google Docs. Usually you have to use an outside vendor. There are several of those that will offer that type of service. Boxcryptor can be used for free, and it's something I've used for several years now. There's another one called VeraCrypt and Sukasa. I believe those are both pay services, but you certainly can look those up. Now, as regards to HIPAA, some of the issues that come up as far as student confidentiality are things like, I want to email parents. Can I email parents sensitive information? Or can I text them? The short answer to that is no, I wouldn't do that. These are the least secure ways of transmitting information electronically. There are ways around it. So my shorthand is, if you need to say, I need to talk to you at a certain time, email and texting is fine. Just try to avoid disclosing any what we call PII, which is personally identifiable information. You may also see it referred to as PHI, which is personal health information. And when you have any of that type of stuff, that's where you get into the violation of confidentiality and privacy. So what I encourage you to do is keep your emails and texts vague. If you send it to the right person, you can say, hey, we need to set up a meeting to talk about some of these things. I have no idea who you're talking to if I intercepted that. And so that's the way it should be. If you need to do things more specifically, then I would encourage you to use the phone. The phone is a very easy way. It's not stored anywhere, and you can talk to the person and have any sort of private communication. Other things that you want to consider, if you are going to use like video conference software to ensure confidentiality, there are systems specifically set up for that are HIPAA compliant. The one that's probably best known is Zoom. Lots of people have been using that. There's also a couple therapeutic platforms that would suffice. Doxy.me, DOXY.me, actually offers a free account for individuals. So I would encourage you to look into that. And then another one is VSEE, VSEE. And that's another one that offers free services, and you can have multiple people on that's HIPAA compliant. Some people are going to ask about, can I use Google Hangouts or FaceTime? Within these extraordinary circumstances, I think those are adequate. I would not depend on those if you listen to this after we're through the crisis, because those have some questions about it. Not to mention FaceTime is really not available to a lot of the individuals out there that do not use Apple products. So there's that issue with it.
Wow, Dan, that's a wealth of information. Let's take it to the next step then, and tell us a little bit about how should consent for services be addressed if school psychs are delivering services virtually?
So I think everybody's aware that, of course, we need informed consent anytime we provide services, and odds are you have that informed consent with students already. However, when you go to a virtual setting, you need to modify that consent or do an add-on kind of consent that is specific to telehealth. It doesn't have to be real long, but you need to make sure that parents know the modifications that you're doing in the service delivery, that they're going to understand the risks and benefits of providing that service, and that they are consenting to that modified service. Some of the things that you want to collect in this informed consent, you want to collect a backup contact number. So if your video fails, you want to go ahead and be able to contact them. You also want to have an emergency contact, a person that knows where that student is and can get a hold of them if you need to. You want to confirm the location where the student is, because we can't guarantee that their home address is going to be the address they're in. Maybe they went out of town or even out of state to go ahead and stay with somebody where that was believed to be a safer environment. And if that's the case, you need to be aware of that. So if a crisis occurs, you know who the local responders can be. If you just assume they're at their home address, you would not be able to get those services to them. You want to talk about some of the risks to confidentiality and the efforts that you are making to maintain it. Some of those efforts, which are going to be embedded in a lot of the programs that I just mentioned, are going to be the level of encryption, that firewalls are available, and that we have backup systems in place, in particular when we're talking about record storage. You want a general statement of the efficacy of your modality. That's just a fancy way of saying that the services that I'm giving have had a proven track record of being equivalent to some of our in-service. And I can tell you there is an overwhelming amount of clinical literature to support the equivalency of telehealth counseling with regular counseling. There's a little bit less regarding consultation, and there is not a whole lot on assessment, though there is a little bit out there. You also want to have an assurance of the sessions not being recorded unless you would specifically agree to it. I have a feeling that some parents may be a little leery, or students, and so if you have that in the informed consent, that may allay those fears and make them more willing to have those type of services. As far as informed consent, there's no one form, though they're all going to have several of the characteristics that I just described. And if you Google real quick and talk about something like teletherapy consent forms or telecounseling consent forms, you're going to see a lot of them up there because they're being created fast and furious. because we're not the only profession out there struggling to provide the remote services with just a moment's notice. So I'll go ahead and let John probably talk a little bit more about the documentation that school psychs should be keeping during this time.
Okay, great. Actually, that is our next question then. So, John, can you take some time and tell us a little bit about what type of documentation school psychs should be keeping while they're delivering services remotely?
Absolutely, and Dan did a beautiful job of talking about the importance of consent, FERPA, HIPAA, and we've got to bear in mind that while we may not be physically within the school, likely the regulations regarding HIPAA and FERPA still are pretty much in place. So you're going to make sure you're still keeping good records, records that you're going to be able to maintain, and their educational records, again, under FERPA. Make sure that you have a record of your informed consent. And remember that consent, it's sometimes misunderstood. People think it's a form, and it's not a form, it's a process with 3 components, knowing, competent, and voluntary. So as Dan nicely identified earlier, that when we make those modifications to consent, for example, confidentiality is going to look different. Here are some of the differences with regard to telehealth, telecounseling, that you have a record that the parent completely understands that, and they're really okay with that as well. So you're going to want to have a record that they definitely gave consent to that as well, that it was voluntary also. A lot of times we do work with our students who have mandated counseling services. Regardless of whether they're mandated or not, having your service delivery logs are still important. You're going to want to have an idea as to how the student is actually progressing. This may be especially important, especially if they are getting mandated services, to determine compensatory education. Because these students are not receiving direct services in school, and there is the gap in service delivery, being able to progress monitor, identify if the student is picking up some of the skills is going to be really important, okay? We're going to make sure that the educational records that are created are maintained in whatever virtual file you're using. And again, Dan talked a little bit about some of the storage implications that we'll have and that we're going to want to have, making sure that your storage is meeting FERPA and HIPAA expectations to the grade, as is required. I think another thing to bear in mind, though, is while these are kind of legal and ethical requirements for record keeping, we're going to make sure we're keeping good records, we also need to be mindful about our current reality. For example, I talked a little bit some time ago about progress monitoring and continuity of services. But we also have to remember that progress monitoring, that we're also doing it in the context of our current paradigm, where students are at home. So for example, I keep using the word anxiety, but I think that's an apt word to use in this for many of our students at this time. You might be seeing heightened anxiety right now, but it also may be related to their current state of what's going on as well. So we want to bear those things in mind. We want to keep our ethical and legal guidelines, but also continue to be mindful of the reality that students are currently dealing with. Finally, I want to identify that I recommend that attached to this webinar is a NASP documentation form that can help you maintain those specific pieces of information that are needed that identify where the student currently is, and again, good continuity of services overall. Good record keeping continues to be important whether we're actually in the school or working remotely.
Great, thanks, John. Melissa, why don't you take a stab to start with just helping us understand a little bit about how school psychologists should be engaging the parents of students when delivering virtual services. And then, John, if you want to fill in a little bit too, your thoughts afterwards, that'd be great.
Thanks, Stacy. We can say that this is probably a very unique time to engage families in a way that we don't typically get to when our kids are just in classrooms or in the schools. So I also want to talk about the potential opportunities for engaging families in a way. And I would think through the informed consent discussion with the parents, it can also give a chance to highlight how these services might look, not just virtually, but how they can be supported within the home environment during this time. And a lot of the, as we're talking about informed consent, I want to go back to only the parents that can give us consent. It is not, the kids can assent to the services, and we certainly hope that they do, but this will require a different kind of engagement with families and some of this process. But as we think about how to support our children and also support the adults, also giving expectations on what you would expect developmentally from a kid. And that development is their age level as well as their learning styles and their cognitive capacity. So thinking about developmentally, how concrete the information needs to be and how much structure and support needs to be in place. Regardless of that, it's still coaching parents about how to help set limits around exposure to this information. The anxiety that John was just talking about, I don't think it's just our kids it's also our parents that are experiencing a heightened level of anxiety. And I know our classroom teachers are too. They are in situations that they've never been in before, and they are also reaching out, seeking support from people that may be their school psychologists, it may be other friends or colleagues. But this heightened anxiety in this world of virtual services is apparent across many settings and many individuals. And so as much as possible, providing materials and resources to parents, to staff, and sometimes that is written materials. It may be even stuff that could get dropped off, or having, if there's material resources from your school, or even maybe you've got a behavior chart that you know needs to be modified to help the kid at home, finding that kind of way to engage the families. Do you have stuff to add, John?
It's difficult to capitalize on that, Melissa. You did such a great job. I think you really talked nicely about a way to keep parents engaged. I like to think about the intersection of indirect and direct services. So consultation versus our direct services, such as individual group counseling. And when we're in the schools, we often look largely to our teachers to give us a bit of a thermometer in terms of how kids are responding. Right now, they're not necessarily going to be able to respond to that. So we're going to need to enroll our parents in a greater way, give us an idea of how the kids are looking on a day-to-day basis. The developmental considerations you brought up, I think, are key. How I work with a K-6 population and how we involve parents at that age may look very different as opposed to our preteens and our adolescents, and their need for privacy, their level of independence, and keeping, again, their unique developmental needs in mind. I may need to work with parents more closely in terms of what are specific strategies they can be using with kids when they're seeing their anxiety ramp up, when they're seeing more signs of depression. We want to make sure, too, that parents have access to outside community service agencies, and being able to access those if the need is acute or specifically great as well. Again, the amount of involvement of the parents is going to probably change regarding on the child's development, but we also have to bear in mind, again, to repeat, that while teachers may not necessarily be there, the parents are the ones who are the best people to be giving that kind of emotional thermometer, and we're going to have to be able to work with them closely and continue to utilize them as partners in helping the kids make progress during, again, these uncertain times.
Well, I'm just thinking about what all of you have been talking about over the last few questions, and it just stresses to me how important communication is right now with our families, with our teachers, with our principals, with the kids. The more we are all able to reach out and recognize the need to connect with one another, to talk about these issues, to problem solve together. We are really all in this together as partners, and I think all of your comments really help us understand that better. So thank you guys very much for that. Our last question today is really, I think, an important one from the standpoint of our kids that we're working with in all different environments. What are some of the social justice issues that are important for school psychologists to really consider during this pandemic? And I'm going to ask Melissa to start off giving us her thoughts on this.
About to say, one of the things that in this discussion that is really prominent to me, we frequently talk about how 80% of the kids who get access to behavioral health services get them through schools. And if that is where our kids are getting access to support services, what does this mean in this window now? And how do we, as the de facto mental health system, how do we make sure that there's some access to support services? One of the things I can't help but pontificate is it's probably realistic to think that you could be providing support services to a kid, and in the process of being virtually in the child's home, you learn about the parent's mental health issues, and you may be one of the few adults or mental health trained professionals that interface with this family. And those are the kind of equity and access, social justice issues that I find myself really concerned about for our school psychologist. Having supervision and support, your problem-solving model, but more than that, having those community connections. We know our emergency rooms are distraught and overrun, or they're becoming that way in many places. And so having plans in place, having connections to resources and supports is one of the critical roles that our providers, our school psychologists can do as they're supporting children and families during this really critical time. After talking about, though, how to respond to the intensive needs, the assumption is that kids have access to computers or phones or internet, and we don't know that that is always true for our kids. So working with your district as best as possible to see if there's ways that they can access these resources and computers and critical materials during these times. We know that there are discrepancies in what is going to be written in our IEPs and our plans for our students and what they may really have access to. So part of what I would recommend is having a list of what services you can provide, knowing that there may be some type of compensatory services that may be needed as time goes on, as our children continue to do school when we all return to a sense of normalcy. The other thing is being conscientious of how our parents may have limited abilities to support their kids because of their own needs during this time. It could be they are not literate themselves. They may have mobility or health issues that restrict their ability to be accessible to their kids. And these are all issues of equity and access that are going to be critical for us to consider as we support our students in need at this time. I wish there were easy answers to some of those. I don't think that there are, which is again why I go back to going to our problem-solving model. How do we really understand this problem? How do we make sure that we use the resources within our community and consult with our supervisors and administrators so that we can provide the best services as possible?
That's great. And I want to just emphasize again the importance of people who are listening to this webinar going on to the NASP member exchange community and really talking about these issues as they encounter them. That's a terrific way, especially if people are isolated and maybe they're in districts where there aren't many school psychs to start with. That's a great way to connect with other people and hear other ideas on how to solve these problems of practice. So some of the key messages we are hoping you get from today. First, the U.S. Department of Ed and your state departments of education and your local LEAs have all issued guidance or some kind of feedback about your services and your supports. We are hopeful that that guidance that's out there is getting to you and that you are able to use it to design your services. Please keep in mind that if you do have specific legal questions, you probably need to be consulting the attorneys on that, as none of us are attorneys on the call today. The uniqueness of the situation has really triggered a need for flexibility. Remember this is the most important gift that the U.S. Department of Education has given us in our guidance because it allows us to do the best we can based on what we know about kids and what we can manage in given the circumstances in this very unique time. So please remember that the flexibility is there. Remote services do require careful attention to the same type of things that you have to think about ethically when you're doing face-to-face services. Do no harm is of critical importance. Be helpful whenever you can. Be truthful about what's happening, what is available, and what is still up in the air. Maintain your records of contact services and supports, recognizing that for some of these kids, your documents will help craft the compensatory services that they'll be eligible for in the future. And so you want to make sure that that documentation is there. Please try and work in all ways to protect student confidentiality and to make sure that you follow through and act with fidelity in all events. If you are asked to provide direct face-to-face services, you need to consider the risks and the benefits balanced against the immediate need for these services. As I said before, the U.S. Department of Education guidance has specifically said that it is not necessary to engage in face-to-face services if that compromises the validity and reliability of that, such as in the case of standardized testing. And so we need to really think about that. However, if you know that a kid is in a situation where that standardized testing is essential for the services to be delivered in some way, then thinking creatively about how to do that is important. And then looking to different standard protocols that might be out there that you can tap into, or resources, public or private, is really important. You need to maintain that validity and reliability standard as best as possible. Please be creative in your thinking about these things. Think about how you can adapt and tailor your services to the kids' new environment, and make sure you use your frames and models for legal and ethical problem solving to direct your behavior. Family engagement and consent is critical. Where you are modifying IEPs or how we deliver services, just make sure parents are aware and that they consent to these modifications, and make sure you've documented those changes. And also remember, consider the limitations that students might have in accessing these services. There are all kinds of reasons why kids may or may not be able to be engaged at this time. Keep trying with them. If you reach out to parents and you don't get a response, think of another way to connect with them. Use a different modality. Try and provide some information that'll get them on board with you. We will have a couple future webinars that will address specific strategies for engaging different kinds of groups, and we encourage you to come back and listen more to our webinar series in the future. NASP has some specific resources to help you. These are listed here at the end of your webinar and are also posted on our website. And then there are some external resources that can be helpful to you, the U.S. Department of Education guidance, as well as the Department of Health and Human Services and the Office of Civil Rights. And as I mentioned earlier in the website, I think it's always really fun to hit Perry Zirkle's resources also, Lehigh, as I think he does a terrific job of helping us as school psychologists navigate these legal and ethical issues. Thank you so much to our panelists today, and for all of you for listening. We wish you safe travels. We wish you a healthy days ahead, and we are hoping to all be back in the school soon. Thank you for your participation.